to our second session in exploring new ways to do stewardship in a pandemic or a post-pandemic church. Those of you who were here for the first session heard me talk a bit about the church I pastored in Atlanta, Georgia, called the Virginia Highland Church. Virginia Highland is an affluent in-town neighborhood in Atlanta. The denomination, the United Church of Christ, had recommended that that church close because it was down to just a couple of dozen people with absolutely no financial reserves. Frankly, they were only able to stay open as long as they did because they had rented their educational space to a preschool. When I went there in March of 2011, they weren't able to pay a pastor. So the deal I struck with them was that I would serve as their unpaid pastor if they would let me experiment with them and see what might revive a traditional, or what I call a vintage church in the 21st century. Well, after being there 3 years or so, we did manage to begin to revive attendance and giving. But I have to say, it seemed to be growing incredibly slowly. It is about this church that I'm talking about that I wrote the book, Fishing in a Shallow Sea. It wasn't that their faith or their devotion was shallow. It was, though, that attendance was so infrequent. This decline in the frequency of attendance meant that the church was actually much larger than it seemed if we only counted butts in pews and bucks in plates. Since the people of this church, that the people that this church now attracted, were generally young people and young families with children, it is that group, of course, that most churches say they want to attract. But this declining frequency of attendance will be a significant factor for all of us, something we are going to have to grapple with as the mostly older people who fill our pews right now pass from the scene. This chart that you're looking at, it may be a bit exaggerated because, well, older members do still come to your church, and they come much more frequently. But if your congregation was made up entirely of the young people that almost every church says they want to attract, this would be a pretty accurate picture, and it would be your biggest challenge. In terms of attendance, our churches are going to need to find new metrics for measuring the health and vitality of our congregations. Maybe the strength of a church should be measured not in terms of how many people it attracts, but in terms of how many people we send out. We mobilize, motivate, empower, and equip to do the ministry of the church, to be the body of Christ. In Atlanta, we often found that people might not be worshiping as often as we were accustomed to people worshiping, but they responded faithfully to opportunities to be in service. The infrequency of worship attendance, that's mostly hard on the preacher's ego. But it doesn't have to be hard on the church's budget. And I want to tell you about how we were able to grow our congregation's generosity and giving much faster than we grew our membership or even our attendance. The first key is that we must create a culture of generosity and trust. In the last session, we talked about how the church needed to stop treating money like it was a four-letter word and start boldly teaching stewardship as a spiritual principle. Materialism, greed, overconsumption, all of these are manifestation of the church's failure to shape our culture's value around money. The world cannot afford for us to remain silent. As far as I know, generosity is the only antidote for the toxic attitudes around money that have developed in the moral vacuum which the church's silence has left. Where will people learn healthy values about money if we do not teach them? Well, the second principle for developing effective 21st century stewardship ministries is something I also talked about in the last session. One of the things our organization strongly advocates is that churches need to separate stewardship from the budget. I learned this principle in one of my earlier churches. The congregation in Dallas had conducted a very successful capital campaign. We raised about $6.5 million. That campaign ended in September. And at the next board meeting, someone asked what my fall stewardship plan was. I said I simply could not talk to this congregation about money anymore. We needed a break. So I suggested that maybe instead of doing it in the fall, we wait until Lent and challenge the congregation to be generous as a part of their Lenten spiritual observance. We actually challenged people that Lent to experiment with tithing for 40 days. Apparently many of them did, because by Easter we were substantially ahead of budget. Now you may have heard the saying, if at first you don't succeed, try again. Well, to that I would add, if at first you do succeed, try not to look so surprised. I'll confess, I was surprised that many people were apparently far more inspired to make generosity a spiritual practice than they were to make a pledge to underwrite the budget of the church. So the following year, we borrowed a phrase from the Promise Keepers movement that was popular back then. And we challenged our folks to become covenant keepers. We asked them to spend the 40 days of Lent taking their covenant with the church and with God seriously. Now, back then our vows, membership vows, were very similar to the membership vows that are used in the United Methodist Church, probably because I spent so many years as a United Methodist. We asked people to uphold the church with their prayers, their presence, their gifts, and their service, and to continue to grow as a Christian. So during this particular Lent, we asked everyone to pray daily. And we gave them all a laminated prayer card, a prayer that we would all pray together. And we asked them to, at a set time every morning and at a set time every evening, to pray that prayer, as the rest of the congregation was praying with them, hoping to put inside of them a habit of prayer. Then, to honor their covenant of presence, we asked them to worship weekly. It might be at a different service or a different time or a different city. It didn't really matter. But every week during Lent, worship somewhere. And for the covenant of giving their gifts, we asked them again to experiment with tithing for 40 days. Then for the covenant of service, we were very tangible. We had a list of specific ways they could serve each week during Lent. sometimes alone and sometimes with the congregation or small groups in the congregation. And finally, for their commitment to continue to grow as a Christian, we ask them to join a small group, or at the very least to commit to reading a couple of books during Lent. This became the intensive time for stewardship. Giving always went up during Lent, and after Easter, it almost always stayed up. Not completely, but higher than it had been before. Now, let me just say that if you're going to make Lent a season of renewal for your church, you need to start right after Christmas. I know that the holidays always leave church leaders and staff exhausted, but Lent, it is the day after Christmas. At least that's the way it feels. It comes quickly. And recruiting and training small group leaders, developing a theme, writing the curriculum that you will need, then getting everyone signed up and committed to small groups and to other practices, all that takes much more time than you think. And the other key to making Lent a transformational time in your church is Transfiguration Sunday. Now, that may seem a bit odd, since none of us really know what the Transfiguration actually was all about. The thing is, Transfiguration Sunday is the Sunday before Lent begins. And since Ash Wednesday will occur before you come back together, you have to work really hard to get everyone there on Transfiguration Sunday so they can sign up and make their commitment and get involved in the covenant that you want them to observe during Lent. I don't know about you, but Transfiguration has never been much of a draw for my congregations. So we started calling it Mardi Gras Sunday. And on Mardi Gras Sunday, we would throw a party and get everyone to come. We would give them beads and balloons and king cake. It was a wonderful celebration before the solemnity of Lent. And I'll say, although most of my pastoral career has been spent in the South, and all of it in Protestant churches, I've discovered that people love taking Lent seriously. So each year, we created a theme that challenged people spiritually. Just last year, I challenged the folks in my current church to experiment with practicing Christianity. You know, the great thing about Lent is it only lasts 40 days. So people are willing to try most anything. And they are amazed. Not only did they survive Lent, but it was actually meaningful. I always say to them, you can sit on a tack for 40 days, and most people will give it a try. One of the most successful Lenten projects that we've ever done was called the Micah Project. We ask every member of the church to commit to following the verse in Micah, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly. So we ask them all to commit to doing an act of justice every day and to doing an act of mercy every day. It can be small things. But then the church would also sponsor a communal act of justice and a communal act of mercy that we could all do together. We also, of course, asked them to walk humbly with God. And in part of that was being a faithful steward, giving generously. That became a spiritual discipline rather than simply the means of underwriting the budget of the church. Now, the third principle is that we must make our churches in this new age people's charity of choice. I hope that phrase will lodge itself in your mind, and you'll continue to think in the weeks ahead about how to make your church the charity of choice for your people and your congregation. What I mean by that is that people should want to spend their money on the work you are doing, well, because your church doesn't pay huge salaries or enormous rent. The dollar to benefit ratio is higher with churches than with almost any charity in America. The trouble is, you don't know how valuable what you are doing is to the community. So how can you tell it? I consulted once with a church in Lawrence, Kansas, and one of the things that surprised me was that it wasn't until President Obama had visited that church that the congregation learned that their church had provided the hospitality, was the host building for the oldest Head Start in America. Their church had done that for years. They just thought of that as a part of the building they didn't go into. But once they learned it and began to discover how much that space was worth, what they discovered was that this church had given tens of thousands, and by that time hundreds of thousands of dollars, to the oldest Head Start in America. Imagine doing that and never knowing it. Doing that and never being able to tell others that your church does amazing things. You see, the tool you need for becoming the charity of choice is a database or a church management system. Now, that may not make any sense to you, but let me give you an example, a simple example from my church in Atlanta. That congregation ultimately started a $1 million homeless ministry before I left, but it started very small. Back then, one Sunday and evening, a group of folks from the church would cook dinner, and they would take whatever they cooked to a nearby Presbyterian church where they provided dinner to a small men's homeless shelter that was housed there. So many people wanted to be involved that eventually started doing it for a women's shelter as well. Now, lots of churches do this sort of thing. The difference is we learned how to measure it. Now, like most preachers, I'm not very good at math, so let me use round numbers and keep it simple. Let's say this ministry was 10 of your members participating in shopping, then cooking, and then serving and eating with homeless folks, then cleaning up afterwards. Every week, that would take about 5 hours. Now, if 10 of your people spent these 5 hours doing that, that's about 50 hours a week total. Now, people would sign up for one shift or another, so they didn't go every Sunday night, and they might just go once a month. But if you take that amount of time and you multiply it by the 20-something dollars that the Center for Nonprofit Management says volunteer hours are worth, you will discover that that little church was already providing $56,000 worth of service to these homeless neighbors. As that church grew more and more, then people began to want to get involved in more ministries, and so some of them went to work at the local food bank, and others would collect socks or toiletry items for the homeless. Now, as you listen to this, what you may notice is that nothing I have listed cost the church anything. But by simply tracking the hours that our people invested in caring for the homeless, we were able to report the value of the work that this small community was doing for homeless women and men in Atlanta, Georgia. As a result of that, reading about us on Facebook, a philanthropist in Houston decided to give our church $1 million She did so because it was one of the most effective and cost-efficient ways that she could find to do something to help the homeless. We became her charity of choice. Though she had never visited our congregation and never worshiped with us at all. But by seeing all that this little church could do with almost no money, and in turn, this congregation invested with her in a place where they could have impact. Before that, at the Cathedral of Hope, we began tracking the time the congregation gave. And soon, we were able to report that our church was giving away regularly over $1.3 million to people in need. One year, after announcing that at our Christmas Eve service, a visitor gave $10,000 to the church in that night's offering. In his book, Not Your Parents' Offering Plate, Cliff Christopher tells a story early on, so I'll repeat the story. You don't have to buy the book. He was at an event where a young lawyer was recognized for giving $1 million to a local boys club. So Cliff Christopher went to see this lawyer to discover what had motivated such generosity from one so young. As they talked, Christopher learned that the lawyer was a person of faith and that he attended his church about 70% of the time. That's very high for a person his age. His gift was motivated by him hearing a young person talk whose life had been changed by this boys club to whom he gave $1 million. Toward the end of their conversation, Christopher asked him if, since he was a person of faith, he had considered giving the $1 million to his local church. He scoffed and said, "Lord, no. They would have no idea what to do with it." Now the question is, would you? Would your church? If someone in your congregation won the lottery, would they give you a little bit of money to help you balance your budget? Or would they turn to you to help them make their dreams of a better world come true? Will future givers spend their money with you because you are their charity of choice and they believe you are the best way they can change the world? You know, as a fundraiser, I discovered that large donors give first because of their belief in the mission of the institution. Then, because they hold the staff or leadership in high regard. And thirdly, they give because they believe in the physical responsibility of the institution. And finally, they give because that institution is making an impact. That is also why millennials ultimately give. I believe they will be the most generous generation yet, but they're going to want to know that their money will make an impact before they make you their charity of choice. You are already doing so much good in the world. So hold up a mirror for your congregation to see themselves, to see just how amazing they already are. Now, the next thing your stewardship team must learn to do is leverage, or if you'll forgive the word, exploit the cultural shift from giving to spending. Now, I'm going to ask you to simply suspend judgment about this trend. My parents' generation, they are givers. Before this pandemic happened, you'd find my parents sitting in the same exact pew in their Methodist church in their small town in South Georgia. And when those heavy brass plates passed, they would drop their check in the plate every single week. Now, of course, they only got their retirement check once a month, but they give a check every single week to their church. Now, over the years, they weren't always thrilled with the pastor the bishop had assigned to their church. But you know, that didn't change where they sat, and that didn't change what they gave. Unfortunately, there are no more 87-year-olds being born. The generation of unconditional givers is passing from the scene. And younger people, who I believe are no less generous, are much more deliberate and deliberative about where they invest their money. More than any other generation, there is evidence that millennials want their money to have an impact, to make a difference, to change the world. And they are willing to use their money, even sacrificially, to do that. The trouble is, they just don't have much money right now. What little they do have, though, they spend on making a difference rather than simply giving to an institution. Crowdsourcing or crowdfunding has worked with this generation because it allows a lot of people giving smaller amounts to support something they believe in. Now, I know churches have long resisted fundraising, but that is a new skill we are going to have to learn, because this is what the future looks like. At its peak, around the turn of the millennium, the Cathedral of Hope United Church of Christ in Dallas was attracting about 2,500 people in person. Most of them were in their 20s or 30s. And although it was a large congregation of mostly professional young people, its giving lagged well behind most churches of that size. Technically, it was the largest progressive megachurch in the South. So, as a strategy for doing more ministry in the world, that church decided that we would exploit this trend from giving to spending. And so what we did was, several times a year, we gave the congregation an opportunity to spend their money on something they cared about, something that would change the world. One example was a program we called Child of Hope. This was obviously an Advent Christmas campaign. The goal was to raise money for children's health clinics, the ones that we sponsored, for mission projects that focused on children, to help do the tutoring that we did for local schools, to buy the uniforms and instruments and supplies that we bought for local inner city schools. The money also went to help the staffing that coordinated all of these volunteer efforts, and to pay the staff of our own children and youth ministry. We took a second offering every Sunday during Advent, and then we took a large second offering on Christmas Eve. We also encouraged our members to give a donation to Child of Hope in honor of people, rather than giving another sweater or tie to Uncle Sam, or giving grandmother more dusting powder when she's got enough to dust the world already. When they gave a gift in honor of these folks, we would then send a card to them telling them all that this donation would go for. The average gift was about $25, and many people, myself included, would just write one large check and give the church my shopping list. Over the years, the Cathedral of Hope raised over $1 million through this program for children. Now, this kind of approach to funding could starve the general fund by diverting giving. But you see, Child of Hope also paid most of the salary of the outreach minister, because they were the ones who coordinated all these programs for children. And it also paid for the staffing of our children's programming inside the church and for our youth group. These expenses could then be shifted from the general fund to be paid for by Child of Hope. Now let me say, all of this was up front. It was all acknowledged. It was all a part of the list of things that we were going to be doing with this money, and we made it clear before a dime was given. I remember that's why Jim Baker ended up going to prison, raising money for one thing and spending it for another. Let's not do that. But be up front, and people are more than happy to give generously to the church when they see the church is making a difference in the world. Now, to utilize this trend from giving to spending, our churches must become the charity of choice. The fifth thing I would suggest that can help your church grow in generosity in these days is that you need to redesign your offering plate. Now, to fund this program, the United Methodist Foundation is now selling a new product. We call them hypnotic offering plates. Just one look into the plate and you will give all the money in your purse and your wallet to the church. I'm kidding, of course, but not about the fact that our churches must find new ways to receive their offerings. This pandemic has forced many of our churches to already begin making this shift, or hopefully has accelerated it. In our next session together, we're going to talk about the specific technology that you need to do electronic giving or recurring giving well. We'll also look at strategies for how to get people to become what I like to call sustaining members. These are the folks who become recurring givers. We'll save that for next time. And in our final session, we will talk about what I would suggest is the sixth principle we must learn. We must make stewardship a year-round part of spiritual formation for our churches, rather than a fall thing that we do to raise pledges to fund a budget. We've already talked about why we need to do this, but in our last session, we want to talk about specifically what your church needs to do to make this so. And after our last session, your church is invited to create the beginnings of a new year-round stewardship program, and then work with me or one of our consultants to formulate a stewardship plan for 2021. Now, that is what we have to look forward to in the next two sessions. For today, though, let me conclude this with a principle that may be more important now than ever before. In a time when we are suffering from so much death and dysfunction in this country, when people are so overwhelmed with grief and sadness and isolation, this is a principle that our churches need to remember is our charge in the universe. When I went to the Virginia Highland Church in 2011, they couldn't pay me. But I was impressed when, for my first Sunday there, they served champagne and pedophores after the service to welcome me. That church taught me the value of champagne in growing a church. That church had been a traditional Southern Baptist congregation when I was in seminary at Emory. By the time I returned to Atlanta, almost 30 years later though, that church had been kicked out of the Southern Baptist Convention because they had ordained women as deacons. So the church had joined the United Church of Christ by the time I arrived. But unfortunately, they had continued to decline almost to the point of death. The fact that they served champagne that first Sunday, though, gave me hope. Not just because I love champagne, but it gave me hope because it was an expression of who they are and were, but mostly of who they wanted to be in the world. After that, every chance we got, we served champagne. And we didn't serve it downstairs in the basement fellowship hall. No. They scattered onto the portico and plaza out front of the church for a party. And everyone who drove by or walked by saw a gathered group that they might want to be a part of. Pessimism, fear, anxiety, depression. All of these things become self-fulfilling prophecies in a church. But I believe so do hope, optimism, and joyful celebration. Listen, I pastored churches too poor to pay a pastor. But I am completely convinced that if our churches will celebrate everything, thank everyone, hold up a mirror to all the great things they are doing now, and throw open the windows so a fresh wind of the Spirit can blow through, I believe if we will do those things, our churches can thrive again. When this pandemic is over, let's not go back to Egypt. You know, the promised land is before us. And it is my conviction that God got the Hebrews out of Egypt. But before they could truly live in the promised land, God had to get Egypt out of the Hebrews. My prayer is that the Spirit may use this terribly painful and challenging time to do the same thing for us. Amen. I hope you will stick around and join us in our Zoom conversation where I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that I can and where I anxiously want to learn from you what wisdom you have to offer on this topic. So I'll see you in the Zoom room.